The man who never really wanted to be president is now wrapping up a trip he didn't really want to take to solve a crisis that doesn't really exist on behalf of voters who, for the most part, don't really support his solution. Welcome to Thursday. With the list of elected Republicans feeling emboldened to part with this president growing, Donald Trump took his hapless wall campaign to the southern border today.
They say a wall is medieval. Well, so is a wheel. A wheel is older than a wall. And I looked, and every single car out there, even the really expensive ones that the Secret Service uses, and believe me, they are expensive. I said, do they all have wheels? Yes. Oh, I thought it was medieval. The wheel is older than the wall. You know that? And there are some things that work. You know what? A wheel works and a wall works. Nothing like a wall. The government shut down because Democrats will not fund border security.
I'm not even sure that's accurate medieval history, but we're going to check for you. This came after nearly a dozen House Republicans broke with the president on the shutdown, voting to reopen parts of the government ahead of tax season. As Trump amplifies the possibility of declaring a national emergency at the southern border, the reality checks on the lack of political will for his wall are now coming in waves. Politico polled the office of 17 Senate and House members who represent Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California about Trump's $5.7 billion border barrier request. Only two, Senators Ted Cruz and Martha McSally, said they supported it. And this from a state lawmaker who represents the region Trump visited today. Quote, quite frankly, I think the folks in Washington, D.C. are out of touch with what's going on at the border. They come down, they do a photo op or in a patrol boat or helicopter. The Democrats point the finger at Republicans. The Republicans point the finger at Democrats, and then they leave. They leave us with the problem. It's just a total circus. It is indeed. And on day 20 of the second longest government shutdown in history, a shutdown that proves that the central argument of Donald Trump's candidacy was a lie, that he could run things as a successful businessman might. A tweet from the Washington Post, Carol Leonnig, who's going to be back this hour, puts it best. She tweets, quote, I think that America is actually engulfed by its second civil war now. Putin Deputy Dmitry Rogozin, my Russian is rocky, sorry. Leonnig adds, I fear this hardline Russian oligarch is more right than wrong, and it's exactly what Putin wanted. Joining our conversation, NBC's Jacob Soboroff from the border in Texas and former Democratic Congressman Donna Edwards joins us. Jacob, you have some unbelievable reporting about how a little low-tech saw, not medieval at all, cut a big hole through the wall.
Yeah, I think, if you didn't follow this closely, a lot of people might be surprised by this, but I don't find it surprising at all. So much of what the president says about what goes on down here is not based in reality. And now his preference for a steel slab barrier, the exact kind that's here in Hidalgo, Texas, has been shown, according to this exclusive photo NBC News has obtained, to be vulnerable to being sawed open with a saw that you could buy at Home Depot. This was down at the prototype location. He had all 8 of them tested, and you can see it with your own eyes. In fact, you can see right through it with your own eyes, Nicole. And this is still when the president is advocating for a wall as basically a one-size-fits-all solution, despite what everybody else around him says, including people at that roundtable today, which I found at times to be a nuanced conversation about drugs coming through ports of entry. I mean, he pointed to 117 kilos of meth that were sitting there on the table in front of him and 4 kilos of heroin. And guess what? They didn't come through areas where there weren't border walls, even this kind. They came through ports of entry. So yet again, another steel slat or whatever you want to call it in the lack of reality in the Trump border wall world.
Donna Edwards, there are so many things that he does that are simply cartoonish and offensive because of the way that they debase the office that he holds. But this is different than that. There are people being harmed. There are people being hurt. There are federal employees that will go without a paycheck soon. Talk about the human consequences of this president.
Well, we've talked about the 800,000 federal workers who tomorrow won't get a paycheck and won't be able to pay their mortgages and meet their obligations. But there are all those people who rely on the federal workforce. They're the contractors. And in communities, a federal building might be the only hub of employment in an entire town. And so that means that every small business in that town depends on a federal workforce. And, to just dismiss it and say, well, work out a deal with your landlords or, pick up some extra business it really is a reflection that you don't understand the lives that people live, who have relatively small incomes. They're supporting their families, and a missed paycheck is about all of those responsibilities. And people who otherwise get up every day and they want to go and do a good job. And so I think for the president and for Republicans to be grandstanding with the president on this when they have an opportunity to open the government today and to stop the harm are simply, sort of burying behind this president on a very ill-fated mission that's going to harm the rest of the American public.
It's a great point. I think what Donald Trump doesn't understand about the federal government is revealed now, too. He thinks there are a bunch of people in D.C. who voted for Hillary. But federal employees are from coast to coast. There are a whole bunch of Trump voters that probably live even in the D.C. area, but certainly from coast to coast, who are harmed. There is an unwillingness to learn anything new as president, but it would have served him well at the beginning of this ill-fated adventure, as Donna just said, to understand exactly who he's harming.
Right. It's a lack of understanding, but also a lack of empathy. Once again, we have seen this president be unable to relate to people who are having a hard time. He mentioned not a word about these workers who, as of tomorrow, aren't going to draw a paycheck. He didn't mention them at all in his Oval Office address. There was no discussion of these federal workers who are now facing unpaid bills and rising debts because they're not getting a paycheck because the government has been shut down over this border wall. And, as we know, as he said himself in this off-the-record lunch with network anchors the other day, this trip is not one he really wanted to take. He felt like he was pushed into it by aides who wanted to have the stagecraft and to go down there and talk about the crisis and such. There's a growing sense in the White House that they're really boxed in here. The Democrats have no incentive to deal. They have no incentive to give him money for this wall. So while it's not a done deal yet, there's certainly momentum growing behind the idea of declaring this national emergency. Right. But even then, the president's going to face some pushback. Members of his own party are expressing real doubt whether that's an appropriate use of presidential powers. This morning, Representative Cole from Oklahoma here on Morning Joe, we asked him about it, and he said he thought it would not be okay. And he's a staunch Trump supporter on most issues. And this is something where I think this is not necessarily the easy way out that I think people around him in the White House hope it is.
Well, Jonathan, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it is hard to predict that anything is a bridge too far for Republicans at this point, right? Because, he's just crossed red line after red line after red line. But this does seem to go to the core of what Republicans say they believe, the kind of limited government they say they believe in, the kind of constitutional government they say they believe in. It seems to go to the core of that, but we'll see. I'm not predicting that we're going to see profiles in courage yet.
John Heilman on the show yesterday said this is a move toward autocracy, that there isn't public support, or else you'd have support in Congress because they're up for election every 2 years. So the big flashing, I think it was yellow 48 hours ago, it's flashing red now, is that the voters are not with him. The president's poll numbers are getting worse on the shutdown, and the numbers for the wall are getting lower, and the anger about the shutdown is getting higher. People keep talking as though an off-ramp is imminent. Do you think an off-ramp is even on the minds of the president and the people around him?
Well, look, in kind of recent history, we've seen that the party that is perceived as taking the government hostage for an unpopular demand is the party that loses. And right now, that is President Trump. I think even his own people understand that the whole country now is hostage to his pride. And they do want a way out. And what's weird about this whole thing is that Democrats are not against walls or border security or fences. There are already borders and walls and fences on the border. What they don't want to give him is his wall. And what he wants is his wall. It's the same thing. He wants to keep pretending that there was a problem he had to solve. And they have to figure out a way to back towards each other until they can both talk about the same thing in different language.
Jacob, I saved you for last because I want you to pull all these threads for me. This talk of a national emergency for the border at a moment in time when border crossings are in a decades-long low. A normal White House would tout that as an accomplishment. This one is trying to lie about its own accomplishments and create a wall to solve a problem that doesn't exist. What's the ground truth?
You know what I think? Actually, you make a good point about the off-ramp, and what Nick is saying, is really well taken as well. If the president wanted to end this, he could see the realities on the ground as they are, not come down here for a photo op as we've been having on the banner on the bottom of the screen throughout most of the day, because that's really what this is. One place he's not going to take a look at while he's down here, the Ursula Border Patrol processing station, where half of the children that he separated from their families is located around the corner from where he spent most of the day today. If he wanted to understand where the drugs actually come from, he could just go out there and do it. He could ask a couple of questions that put him sort of more on an intellectual par with people that he's negotiating with about the need for a wall, where it's necessary, what type of infrastructure, what type of technology the Border Patrol actually wants and needs down here. Kevin McAleenan, the CBP commissioner, was talking about additional screening mechanisms at ports of entry. But the president doesn't hear it. He's like a horse in a race with blinders where he's just looking forward at the detriment of the American people, 800,000 of whom are sitting at home or furloughed or whatever, because he wants more of this when that's not everything that's necessary.
Jacob, do the folks that you talk to on the border, in and out of the government in those towns, believe that the border is a national emergency that justifies Donald Trump declaring one?
Not one that happened without Trump making it happen, I guess is what I'm trying to say. President Trump has manufactured, as you and I have talked about many times, a crisis of his own making. First, it was the separated children. Then it's the metering of the people coming through the desert. You see these two horrific deaths of the young children that didn't have to happen. The crises here are ones that President Trump exacerbated if he didn't create, himself, Nicole. And people here know that. I mean, people live their lives here and they see it every day.